I'm a consultant for the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is the kind of the government standards organization in the United States. About a year and a half ago, we published a new set of standards on authenticating users, primarily intended for U.S. government websites and applications, but a lot of other people use these standards as well, and we encourage that. I'm actually here in Prague as part of a group called Internet Engineering Task Force, which meets 3 times a year at different places around the world. We're meeting out at the Hilton this week, and there I'm doing largely email security standards and things of that sort. I've been an independent consultant for the past 5 years or so. I was a couple of years at a startup as a chief security officer at a startup. And before that, for quite a few years, was at Cisco doing a variety of things, including security. So I wanted to explain, as I always do, that I'm just a paid consultant to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I don't work for the US government. So everything that I'm saying here is, I think, accurate, but it's officially only my opinion and not the opinion of the United States. And so, you know, if you need an official answer, there are ways to ask the United States for that. So I'd like to start off with some principles that I want to kind of talk about how we're going to follow some of these principles in designing authentication. Now, I'm assuming here that we're talking primarily from the standpoint of people that are developers of applications, people that are developers of websites, things like that, that require users to sign in. And we want to design that better. We want the user experience to be good, because not only does that make the users happy, but when the user experience is difficult, they start they get creative and they find shortcuts. And when they do that, it's not good for security. It's not fun for them, and it's not good for security, so we want to avoid that. We want to have realistic expectations. Passwords alone are not great security. If you're doing something that's really sensitive, you should have 2-factor authentication, typically something like a password, and something that you have, which could be your mobile phone, which could be a device that plugs into your USB slot. As we have time available, I'll talk about some of those things quite a bit. But you want to, you know, we're still going to be using passwords, I expect, for quite some time, and there are sorts of applications that's appropriate for, but if you need security, you should use a password plus something else. One of the things that I try and emphasize in these talks is to take as much of the burden on ourselves as application developers or the people that run applications, and not to put that on the users. So we'll talk about things like password rules, which I'm trying to get us to avoid, to get away from, in favor of doing some things that improve the security on the server end of the connection. I don't want us to be asking people to do things that don't actually help. So there are a lot of times that I'm asked to, you know, maybe create a password at a website or something like that, and I know that the things that they're asking for don't really help security, and they're just annoying. So let's not do that. Let's figure out what that is and avoid doing that. And the biggest goal here is to separate the real user that's signing in from the fake user that's signing in, somebody that's an attacker that's signing in as a user. And so everything that we can do to pull those apart, make life easier, make it more accurate for the real user, and make it harder to sign in for the not real user, is what we're really trying to do. And we have to remember that the users, there are lots of different kinds of users. There are people that speak different languages. There are people, especially when we talk about maybe government websites where people are applying for benefits. Some of the people might be homeless. Some of the people might be in wheelchairs or have difficulty doing things with their fingers. There's just a lot of different sorts of users, and we should think about who they all are, because some of the ones that you don't think about may be the ones that need the most help. So I'm going to use the word password a lot, and I'm going to start by saying what I consider a password to be. We use, actually in the standard that I've worked on, we use the term memorized secret in order to sort of just come up with a word, because sometimes people say password, passphrase, PIN, something you know. Those are all passwords. So let's just say password and remember that it can be any of those things. I'm not trying to limit ourselves to things that are only single words, for example. And we need to be thinking about what kinds of things the attacker is going to do. So we need to think about online attacks. Basically, it's typically guessing the user's password. Maybe they have some inside information, like from another website where they've used the same password, or maybe they don't. There are offline attacks, typically where they go after the verifier and are trying to, maybe they've exfiltrated some information from the verifier and are able to leverage that in some way in order to get to the user. And then there are other sorts of what I'll generally call side channel attacks. Now, some people think of side channel attacks as very sophisticated things like looking at power consumption or timing and all of that. But I include even things like looking over somebody's shoulder is a type of side channel attack. Just anything that you can do in order to pick up the password some other way other than logging in. And there are sometimes that the attacker is going after a particular person, maybe typically an important person like the chief financial officer of a company or the treasurer of a municipality of a town or a city. And they'll be maybe spear phishing or something like that in order to try and get to them. But then there are other attacks where the attacker really just wants to get into any account and see what they can get. And so they'll kind of go after it in bulk. So they're very broad attacks, and they're very targeted attacks. So online attacks are primarily guessing the password. And it can be a brute force thing where you take common passwords like password and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 if it's a PIN, and just guess those. And those attacks happen. And then there's a class that's referred to as password stuffing. And that's a case where users have maybe used, a lot of people use the same web password at multiple places. And that's a very unsafe practice. That's the first, my neighbors ask me from time to time, what should they be doing for security on their computers? And I say the first thing you should do is make sure you don't use the same password in multiple places. Even if you can, even if they're a little bit different. Sometimes people combine the name of the site with some string or something like that. Also not a good idea because the attackers have seen all of this. They've learned all of these tricks. So that's the first thing. And so don't use the same password. If you're having trouble managing them, password managers are probably a pretty good idea. Pick a good password manager. So the primary defense against an online attack is throttling, and I'll talk a little bit about throttling later. It has to be done sort of carefully in order to avoid creating other sorts of problems. And another thing that you can do as an operator of a site is to keep people from using the really common passwords. So you don't want people, if somebody picks it as their password types password or QWERTY, or there are any number of things that are commonly used as passwords, you should probably not let them do that, or you should at least coach them and say, this is not a good idea, because your account is not going to be safe that way. Offline attacks are different. And so what happens is attackers will break into a website, for example, and they will try and exfiltrate, try and get out the data in the password file. Now, this is hopefully stored in a form that's reasonably secure, and we'll talk about some of those forms. Michael does a very good job of trying to keep sites honest about and challenging them to do a good job with the way that they store their passwords, because even if they're stored in a form that seems pretty good, the attackers have access to huge amounts of hardware resources in order to try and brute force guess the passwords from those. And of course, if they have access to that file, they can make as many guesses as they want as fast as they can, and they have a much better chance of guessing your password than if you're doing an online attack, where at a minimum you have to send the password in and wait for a yes/no response. And there are a lot of defenses against these offline attacks as well that we'll talk about. Harder to defend against offline attacks than online attacks. So you really want to be careful about how you store that information. And then side channels, I mentioned, it's things like shoulder surfing and key loggers. For example, if you've got malware running on your PC, that's another example of a side channel that you should be concerned about. Now, password length is the one thing that you can most reliably say is going to help the strength generally of your password. Of course, if you make your password longer by making it password, password, password instead of password, it doesn't necessarily help. But generally, if you add more characters to your password, it's stronger. Now, so as a website operator, should you say, okay, well, I'm going to start requiring 24-character passwords? I don't think that's necessarily a good idea, because they'll go to password, they'll get creative again. Password, password, password. Or you've probably seen online, often people tweet pictures of monitors that have Post-it notes at the bottom with, say what the password is. You don't want people to have to do that. You want people to choose something that's long enough, memorable to them, but not to impose an exceedingly long requirement. And then there's another reason for this. This is a kind of an interesting graph from an academic paper, which I've referenced here. And we'll have the slides available online afterwards, so you can look at some of this if you want. But this talks about the difference in password length, and the blue line is a protection against online attacks. And so if you've got a very short password, there isn't even much protection against an online attack. But in order to defend against an offline attack, it needs to be maybe 8 characters longer. So I guess the question is, if you're concerned against if you're concerned about somebody that's going to exfiltrate your password file and do guesses against that, you probably need to impose a requirement of maybe 16 characters or something like that on the password. Users aren't going to like that, and they aren't going to remember those passwords nearly as well and do other things. The approach that we've used in the standard that we've been working on in the United States is that 8 characters, which is enough to protect against online attacks, is perhaps sufficient. But what we're going to do instead, and this is an example of taking more of the burden on ourselves than on the users, what we're going to do instead is impose a lot of requirements on how the passwords are stored so that if they do manage to get that credential file out of the system and analyze it themselves, they're not going to be successful. So that's, so we want to encourage users to use longer passwords that are memorable, but we don't want to require them to come up with a password that's longer than it needs to be. And then there's a question of maximum length. You see a lot of sites that have, maybe between 8 and 12 characters is how long the password needs to be. And there's no reason for that. Why not allow 64 characters or something like that? Because maybe if there's a phrase that they like or something like that, then use the whole thing. Let the user be as secure as they want to be. Now apparently there's an issue with if you put in a megabyte long password, then some of the hashing algorithms tend to take a long time, and there's apparently a denial of service attack. I haven't seen it, but I'm told it's there. So 64 characters is pretty good. People can pick a phrase that they like, hopefully not something from their favorite movie, which is probably listed on Facebook, right? But some phrase that hopefully is meaningful only to them. And we want to give them as much flexibility as possible. Same with space characters. A lot of places you're not allowed to put a space character in a password. Why not? There isn't any good reason for that. We talked about doing something with multiple spaces. That's probably not important. By the way, I'm gonna try and hit the high points here. I've got more slides than I can probably present in this period of time, so I'm gonna go a little bit quick on some of the things that are less important. Character set, and of course, here in the Czech Republic, you have accents that we don't have in the United States. And we want people, and this was somewhat written for a US audience, we want people to be able to, if they're not an English speaker, they should be able to come up with a password in their own language the way that they're used to typing it. And so we encourage Unicode characters. And of course, when you put Unicode characters in, that means people can use emoji in their passwords. And sure, that's fine. Just make sure that you have enough emoji and they aren't all smiley faces, right? Or frowny faces. So the other thing is that we want people to use, there isn't any reason. Sometimes you get these sites that say, include a special character, make sure that it's a comma, period, there's some particular set of special characters. Why can't you use more of them? Those of you that might be familiar with things like SQL injection attacks and so forth might think that, well, you want to make sure there aren't quote characters there so that they can't create an SQL injection attack. It doesn't apply. The first thing that you're going to do when you get the password from the user is you're going to hash it. You're going to run it through SHA-256 some number of times, for example. And so that quote character is going to be long gone by the time it gets anywhere near a database if you're doing things right. So there's no reason that people shouldn't be able to use any character that they want in a password. Now, we still see lots of places that ask for, they call them security questions. Sometimes there are hints. All of these things, don't do it. All it is it's another password, and it's got all of the worst characteristics. Because if you're asking, what was the name of your first pet? Then, first of all, the name of your first pet is perhaps on Facebook because the pet died 5 years ago and you wanted to commemorate their death. And if there are, 10 different sites that ask the name of your first pet and you put the same pet name there, you've now got 10 sites that had the same password. And that was the thing that I try and encourage my neighbors never to do. Don't use the same password on multiple sites. These security questions are typically just another password, except it's an easier to guess password. It's terrible. I don't know why they do that. So don't. And then there are other sites that ask for a hint. And we've got a little game a little bit later here where I'll go over some of the hints that we've run across in the past, and they're really silly. So as somebody who runs a site, don't do that. If you're required to do a security question as part of your account creation at some site, then hopefully you're using maybe a password manager, and you can generate random passwords and fill them in as the answers to your security questions and put them in the notes section of the site on the in the password manager, and you've got better security as a result. Just don't lose track of your password manager. You'll have trouble convincing the site that you actually lost your password if that was what happened. So composition rules are what we refer to as these rules that say you have to have an uppercase character, you have to have a lowercase character, a digit, a special character, all of those things. Look at this list of rules here. There's all these things that you need to keep track of, and I've actually had trouble. I got a new bank account recently, and I had to register with the bank. And I had the worst time trying to come up with a password that was acceptable. And part of the reason was that they only accepted certain special characters, and their website told me the wrong ones. So I was creating all these passwords and like, what's wrong with my password? And finally, I used a different special character, and it worked. And that was the problem. Because once I created the account, then I went to change my password, and it gave me a different list of special characters there. So I still need to bug them about that. Different languages, it's probably, the same rules don't apply in terms of what's applicable. So we'll talk about, actually coming up next is to talk about using a block list of words or passwords that shouldn't be accepted. Now, so we encourage the creation of a list of common passwords. Remember that we're trying to defend primarily against online attacks, against guessing. So it's really the common choices. If you have too small of a list, then there are common words that you're not including. If you have too big of a list, and there are lists that have been created that are enormous now, then you get frustrated users because they can't find a password that doesn't appear on the list somewhere, and then you get creative users that do things like they take the password and it says that's not acceptable, so they add an exclamation point to the end. Still not acceptable. 2 exclamation, they'll do something very predictable. You don't want to drive the users to do something predictable when choosing a password. So, in any case, a dictionary, which doesn't mean it's words, it can be anything that's commonly used as a password, or things that you think will be used. Sometimes if it's the taxing authority, I don't know, it's IRS in the United States, I don't know what it is here, but you know, sometimes people will, for their tax account, they'll use some bad word followed by IRS. So maybe that should be in the dictionary for the IRS. So if somebody picks a bad password, this is really, we think of it as a coaching opportunity. Carnegie Mellon University, I was talking with one of the professors there, and she had some research done, and it's this paper in 2017. There's a reference at the end. And they talk about, you know, what happens if somebody gets told, sorry, that's not a good password. Will they do the same thing and put a 1 at the end, or an exclamation point, or you know, will they do something predictable? So really what we're suggesting is that, you know, you want to kind of give them some advice. They like password strength meters. That might be one way to use it in this case, is to kind of help the user pick something stronger when they make their second attempt. So it's pretty easy to build a reasonable dictionary. There are lots of word lists that are out there. I did some work generating a list of about 100,000 entries, and it looked like it was a pretty good list. That's even maybe a little bit long in some cases. But be careful about that second thing. Now, there are a number of user interface things that apply to passwords. You almost always don't see your password when you type it. You get dots or stars or something like that. And that's good if you think there might be somebody looking over your shoulder. How often do you think somebody is looking over your shoulder when you're entering your password? Not that often, perhaps. So maybe you should have some way to allow the user to display their password. Remember that there are people that have physical disabilities that may have trouble typing their passwords reliably. Or maybe somebody's in a moving vehicle and has trouble typing their password. Or something like that. Or they live in an earthquake zone. No, I live in an earthquake zone. It doesn't happen that often. A nice thing to do is to have some way to display the password so that when the user gets it wrong, they have the ability to see what happened, or to see what as they're typing if they're having trouble typing it. This is just being nice to the user, really. Now, another thing about passwords that you run into a lot is expiration. You've probably all run into places, I don't know what the rules are here at the university, but you know, change your password every 3 months or 6 months or a year or whatever. We don't believe that's a good idea necessarily. When people know that they're going to have to change their password in 3 months, they're less invested in coming up with a good, secure password. Or they do something like they just change one character or a digit or something like that in the password. I did that myself when I've been in that situation. And so we would really rather people pick good passwords, invest in them, know that they're going to be around for a while, and not having to constantly change them because they tire quickly. But be prepared that there might be a situation where there's some evidence that the password or a bunch of passwords have been compromised. So do build in the ability to require a change of password, you know, when an administrator says, we think this account's been breached. But just don't do it just routinely, because that leads to a lot of fatigue. So when you're verifying a password, there are a bunch of different steps, and I'll kind of walk through walk through the progression, and we hope you go through and do all of these things, of course. The first of them is hashing, which is, of course, taking the password and running it through, very simplistically, an algorithm like SHA-256. Is everyone familiar with hashing algorithms? Any questions? OK. I'll assume that you know what I'm talking about there. So you could store SHA-256 of the password. But an attacker could, if they got a hold of a great big huge password file, could very easily not only guess some passwords, but they could like guess a password and look at all of the entries and say, oh, well, these 5 people have their password is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that was really easy to break into. So the way that you deal with that is with something called salting, where you add a random value to the password and hash that combination, and then you store both the random value and the hash. And that basically foils lookup tables or search for duplicates. But the attackers have access to lots of hardware, and they can guess really fast. So we're slowing them down some here, but not enough. So what we do is we do what's referred to as iterated hashing. And there are a number of approaches. One that we talk about, and they're actually more sophisticated algorithms as well. There's an algorithm called PBKDF2, password-based key derivation function version 2. I think that's what it stands for. It basically gives you the ability to run that same process thousands of times. It really doesn't take very long to do 30,000 iterations of a hash. And especially when you're just the website and somebody's logging in, so it's really not adding that much to your time verifying the password. But the difficulty here is that there's an awful lot of technology that's been developed for the cryptocurrency mining, for Bitcoin mining and so forth. There's the hashing has been made, hardware has been made to do hashing very quickly for that application. And so even that isn't quite good enough. They use things like graphics processors and so forth to defeat that. And so there's what we refer to as time and memory hardening. And these are algorithms that are both slower, but also take a lot of memory to run. So they require a lot of resources in order to crack the passwords. And bcrypt is an example of that. And so that's kind of the best in the hashing world. And then one thing that I keep trying to push is this thing that's referred to as keyed hashing. And so you can do all of the stuff that we've done before and then do one more thing besides. And the one more thing is you take the result, ship it off to probably another processor entirely, maybe even just a small processor that's on the same network, that's not doing anything else, so it's not exposed to the outside world, so it's harder to break into. Could be even a hardware security module or something like that. And ask it to do a hash which includes a secret key, and then return the result. So as long as the secret key doesn't leak, and it's pretty well protected because it's in a separate processor here, the hashes then are not at all useful to somebody that's trying to crack the passwords. And so it's a relatively inexpensive but very effective way to defeat the password hashing attacks. And I've got a little bit of code out on GitHub that kind of shows how simple it is to do that. So let's talk about a case study here. In 2013, Adobe had their password records breached. And about 130 million of them. And they did a lot of things wrong. They'd probably get like a D score from Michael, right? F-. F-, okay. I was being very generous. But it included the email address of the user, so we knew who it was, which is helpful in some cases. It included their encrypted password, but it was encrypted just using a secret key. It wasn't salted. So everybody that had the same password had the same value in the password file. And there was a password hint, which was not encrypted. You can't really encrypt the password hints because you have to be able to display them to the user, right? And so there ended up being about 56 million distinct encrypted passwords there. And there were a lot of different things that you could do here. You could take all of the hints and try and correlate them. Like if you had the same hashed password, or same encrypted password rather, you could take all of the records with the same encrypted password and look at all of the hints. And now you've got a lot of hints for what the password is. So it doesn't even need to be significant to you. And then once you've done that, you can take the email address and try and use that same account on all sorts of other services and see if they use the same password in other places. And a lot of people did. There were a couple of things that were fortunate. Nobody ever got the encryption key, as far as we know. And as a result, they weren't actually able to directly crack the hashes. Instead, you had to play this game. And so here's the game. And this is probably a little bit of an eye chart, especially for you in back. But this particular password occurred 697 times in the database, and there were 152 distinct hints about this password. And here are the hints, which included things like Glenlivet, whiskey, Highland videotape manufacturer, single malt, and Johnny Walker. Does anyone have a guess what the password is? Scotch was the password. And I know that because one of the people that had this password is a friend of mine and told me that that was correct. So the lessons learned from this shows you the danger of not salting your passwords. And it shows you the danger of password hints can really hurt. And but one other lesson is that this one encryption key that we think was never breached, it shows that it's often easier to protect one small key like that if you store it separately than it is to protect an entire large database. So here's another issue, and this is, we were talking about security questions a few minutes ago. And there are various names for it, knowledge-based authentication, things like that. These are sort of passwords with hints. So the same thing about hints sort of applies here. Except it's a little bit worse than that, because if the oftentimes you'll get the name of a school, and well, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll talk about the difficulty is you can't really hash the answers to these security questions because they're not always going to be typed the same. So our case study for this is an outfit called Ashley Madison, which was kind of notorious for helping people cheat on their marriages, or claim to be. And their breach included clear text answers to the knowledge-based authentication questions. I think there was a choice of 3 different questions that people could have. One of them was, what high school did you attend? And the answers there, one popular answer was Central High School. But that, you look through the database and there was Central High, Central HS for high school, Central, all of these things. So it kind of showed that you couldn't just, that really the answers were intended for somebody that was going to be making an approximate match, and therefore this wasn't going to be hashed. So we've talked almost exclusively about passwords now, and what I'd like to do is go on to, if you need higher security, you need two-factor authentication, and there are lots of ways to do that. And I'll talk about why we have so many different ways to do two-factor. Kind of one of the cheapest ways, people talk about two-factor authentication is expensive because I need some special hardware or something like that. One way to do two-factor authentication is lookup secrets, which can be either these things on wallet cards or just a set of single-use keys that you print out and maybe store away somewhere. The disadvantage is that you can't, they have a lifetime in the sense of you should probably be using each of these only once. And when the user runs out, then they can't log in using those anymore, and they need to generate another set. But the big advantage here, and these are really well suited as a sort of a backup form of authentication if they forget their password, if they forget their other sort of two-factor device that they use. Lookup secrets are a great way to authenticate that really doesn't cost the site any money. You don't have to buy any hardware for the user. So this kind of overcomes one of the big objections about two-factor authentication. Another way to do it that you see very often is out-of-band authentication. The common case is you get a text message on your phone when you're trying to log in that says, the code is 644732 or something like that, and you have to enter that on the website. It's better than not using two-factor authentication, but we've had a lot of problems, at least in the United States, and I'm pretty sure it's been seen elsewhere in the world, with people's phone numbers being stolen, where somebody will walk into a store and say, hey, I'm John Smith, I lost my phone, I'd like to buy another phone from you and have you put my old phone number on it. And of course, the person that's selling the phone wants to sell a phone, they want to help the user, and they don't necessarily check their identification thoroughly. And so people get their, and this is primarily on targeted attacks, they get their phone number stolen, and then somebody is able to authenticate as them. And this has happened thousands of times in the United States. It happened to the chief technologist from the Federal Trade Commission, had her phone number stolen. I don't think it was for an authentication thing, but it shows how easy it is to do. So we're really trying to discourage people from using just text messages to authenticate users. We'd like them to use some sort of a secure communications application, because what we're doing with an out-of-band authenticator is this is trying to be something that you have. You're trying to prove that you have your phone. And so if you've got an app on your phone that can communicate securely and only to this phone, then you've proven I've got this phone. If you send an SMS to a Google Voice number or something like that, you can probably retrieve that SMS in any number of ways, and you're really not proving that you have something. So actually, I'm a little bit ahead of myself here. So So generally try and avoid doing that. Now I know in Europe, in some countries, I don't know if they have them here in the Czech Republic, some of the banks have special SIM cards or they store secrets on the SIM cards that allow a more secure form of text message with the bank. And if you've got that, that's fine to use because you're really establishing that you've got that particular SIM card, which is the thing that you have. So go ahead and use that if it's available. We don't have it in the United States. I wish we did because we'd be able to do this, do a better job of using the phone. Because otherwise, everybody's got their phone with them. It's a great idea for doing that. There's one-time password devices and one-time password apps. You've probably seen or may have seen things like Google Authenticator and Microsoft Authenticator that will display a bunch of changing one-time passwords for you. They change every 30 seconds or something like that. And the idea here is that you're proving that you have this device because it has been enrolled with the Authenticator app. And so again, and there also have been for a long time dedicated hardware devices that generate these values as well. When you're doing this, you probably want to limit the amount of guessing that people can do. So you want to, if they make a bad guess, you want to make them wait a little bit before they're allowed to guess again. So generally a pretty good approach. The difficulty is that the verifier that's checking this one-time password has to have the same, what we refer to as a symmetric secret. It has the same key as what's on the device. So anyone who has that key can generate that 6-digit number. Well, a few years ago, there was a security breach where somebody got away with a whole bunch of those keys and was therefore able to pose as any number of users, at least from the standpoint of their second factor. And so it's a good approach, but if you're going to do this, you have to protect the keys very well. And then there's a whole litany of different kinds of cryptographic devices. How many of you have heard of a standard called FIDO? Good, okay, about half. So FIDO is an emerging standard. Number of different manufacturers are supporting, and it takes a few different forms. This thing in the middle is a FIDO authenticator. It plugs into your USB port, and when you're logging into a site that requires it, you just tap the little gold circle there, and it does an actual challenge response protocol with the site using public key cryptography, so that the verifier site, even if the verifier site is breached, they can't generate the public key signature that's required in order to authenticate somewhere else. So it's something that we call verifier compromise resistant. It means that even if the verifier is compromised, it's resistant to use by someone else. And so those work well. There are, of course, things like smart cards, which are there up on top, which is another sort of cryptographic device. And then, of course, NFC when you're using your credit card or if you're doing some sort of authentication. And some of the FIDO devices now also will support NFC as well, that you can tap or get close to a device that you're trying to authenticate. The key thing with a cryptographic device is that it's always connected in some way, and I mean connected in both the hardware way and in the NFC or Bluetooth or whatever way. It's always connected to the endpoint so that it's a challenge response protocol that's taking place. Now, one of the things that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself again here. Now, a lot of people expect that, and they ask about, well, what about using biometrics? If I use my fingerprint, or if I use my iris, or my retina image, or any number of those things, isn't that really the gold standard? Isn't that what we're all going to? Then maybe I won't have to remember a password. I'll just use my fingerprint and my device, and I'm all done. Isn't that'll be a wonderful world when we get there? Well, the difficulty that we have is that biometrics are not as good as everybody thinks from a performance standpoint. I mean, they do the right things generally, but the accuracy of a biometric measurement is not as good. We've had to specify that if some random person comes up to your biometric sensor and, let's say, gives their fingerprint or iris or whatever, that the standard that we've had to adopt is that it has a 1 in 1,000 chance of succeeding. That's much worse. That's like a 3-digit PIN. Much worse than other things that we require. And a lot of them are in practice better than that, but they're still worse than the things that we hold ourselves to for the cryptographic standards. The problem that I have with biometrics, I mean, I love the biometric sensor on my phone, but if I've been working in the garden, my hands are dry and dirty, it doesn't work. I have to use my PIN. If I've been washing the dishes at home, my hands are wet and soft, it doesn't work, I have to use my PIN. So, and then there are people that work, and this is part of trying to remember who your population is, who your user population is. There are people that have jobs that wear their fingerprints off. And so there are some people that really don't have fingerprints. So maybe they've been burned or something like that too. So there are lots of problems with that. In addition to the fact, and a lot of people talk about this, you leave biometrics everywhere and they're hard to revoke. I've got fingerprints all over this bottle here. And I'll probably just throw it in the trash when I'm done.
I'll take care of it.
Okay, sure. So. And then there's a bunch of different modalities. So one of the things that makes biometrics different from the other things that we've been talking about is that it's a noisy measurement. I used to, early in my career, I dealt a lot with communication systems where you were trying to determine whether the signal that you received was a 1-bit or a 0-bit. And there was noise. And so you had a distribution of 1 bits, which you could consider to be maybe the green bell curve there, and 0 bits, which was the red bell curve. And it's very much like this, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to distinguish in a noisy environment the right person presenting their fingerprint from the wrong person presenting their fingerprint. And so it's a probabilistic sort of thing. You have to pick a threshold, and yeah, you can get the false accept rate as low as you want, but that might mean that an awful lot of the time the correct user doesn't get authenticated. You need to, again, not frustrate the correct user. So the idea here is to recognize this and use the biometrics effectively. So we talk about a best practice is to associate the biometric with a specific physical device, preferably verifying it locally, so the biometric that's stored there doesn't go anywhere. So like with my phone, I mean, it unlocks when I do this, and it's not connected to, well, it is connected to a network, but it doesn't have to be. The verification is done here. The biometric never leaves the device. And there is a backup pin for when I'm washing the dishes or something like that. So they've done that very well. They also impose a limit on how many bad attempts you can get. You know, if I use the wrong finger here, it eventually says, okay, I need you to enter a PIN. So they've done a very good job of understanding the limitations of biometrics. And so you still need a backup factor, like a memorized secret, a password. Now, across all of these different authenticators, there's a whole lot of what I'll call common considerations, a lot of things that apply to different classes of authenticators that I wanted to talk briefly about. One of those is throttling. We talked earlier about limiting the number of guesses in order to try and foil online attacks. And so throttling is the primary defense mechanism. Now, the difficulty is that if you do too much throttling, then an attacker, you got to think about what all of the motivations of your attackers might be. One of the motivations of your attacker might be simply to prevent the legitimate user from logging in. You know, maybe they're trying to harass them or something like that. So, you know, we talk about kind of guidelines for doing that. You know, kind of gradually slowing users down so that they don't get locked out all of a sudden. Things like using CAPTCHAs, including IP address information, if there are particular IP addresses that are known to be reliable and less reliable, you can take that into account. Adaptive techniques. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to over-throttle, because you don't want, you know, if you're a commercial website or something like that, you don't want to have people constantly calling your support line because they guessed their password wrong 5 times or something like that. You want it to be a large enough number that you're defeating the online attacks, but you're also letting the legitimate users in even if they're having a bad typing day. Now, we've got this sort of complicated phrase that we refer to as verifier impersonation resistance. A lot of people would call it phishing resistance. I was reluctant to call it phishing resistance because a lot of people call a lot of different things phishing. But the goal here is to keep a man in the middle from authenticating for their own session. So, and I should probably have a picture, a diagram to go with this, but let me kind of describe it to you. The user's logging in, but they get directed to the wrong website that looks like the legitimate website. When they do that, you know, they enter their credentials, and that website, perhaps in real time, takes those credentials and logs in for their own session. Maybe so I'm trying to log into my bank. I'll log into the wrong bank, or the wrong website that I think is my bank. The attacker then, which operates that website, uses those credentials in order to log in for themselves and access my bank account. Now, some of the things that we talked about here, like the one-time passwords, yeah, they change every 30 seconds, but the attacker's going to do the attack in real time. So the 30-second timeout isn't going to keep them out. The goal here, you don't want to depend on the user to detect a fraudulent website. They're doing a better and better job all the time of creating fraudulent websites. It used to be that you could depend on the fact that maybe their language capabilities, they don't know Czech quite as well as a native speaker, or in our case, they don't know English as well as a native speaker. What you would like to do is you would like to have an authenticator that tightly binds the authentication, what we call the authenticator output, the output of that device, maybe that FIDO token or that smart card that you've plugged in. You want it to bind tightly to either the identity of the site or to the actual TLS session that you're authenticating to. And if you do that, then somebody that's trying to log in elsewhere, maybe on another TLS session, isn't going to be able to use that same output because it won't be valid for them. So what this requires is that it needs to be a cryptographic authenticator that's directly connected to your endpoint in order to, because it has to be able to access the information about the secure session that you're connecting through. And if you're able to do that, then you end up with an authentication that you're pretty certain is not going to be subject to any sort of a man-in-the-middle attack, and in particular not a traditional phishing attack. So client-authenticated TLS, so things like smart cards and so forth, are verifier impersonation resistant, as are FIDO authenticators. Both, of course, directly connected. Another question that you might ask as somebody that operates a website or operates an app is, we want users to be able to bring their own authenticators, bring their own devices in order to authenticate. Then, for one thing, it's more convenient for them. They don't end up with a whole key ring of different keys for different sites. But it also means you save some money. You don't have to buy these. But if they do that, how do you know how strong this authenticator is? Is this a piece of hardware, or is this a software-based certificate that is probably not as strong authentication? Is this itself a two-factor authenticator, one that you had to use a biometric or a PIN in order to access? Or is it just a single factor that you need to supplement with a password? Well, all of those questions become relevant if the user is supplying their own and not something you supplied to them that you know about. So there's a characteristic called attestation. Some of these authenticators actually have a certificate on them that describe themselves from the manufacturer that says, I was made by this particular company, and here's what kind of an authenticator this is, and you can depend on that. And so this is something that's kind of an emerging thing as people are trying to use more of their own authenticators, and it's important. Otherwise, you have to kind of assume the worst from, say, a cryptographic authenticator. You have to assume that it's maybe software-based, which isn't as good. And then I talked a little bit about verifier compromise resistance. If you're using things like public keys if you're storing, say, public key value as part of the login credentials for the user, as opposed to storing, hopefully, nothing in clear text, but even a hashed value is not as good. The public keys are what we call verifier compromise resistant, which means somebody breaks into the verifier, somebody breaks into your website or something like that. The information that they're able to get there is not going to help them log in as a user. And then, of course, replay, you want things to be preferably challenge response and so forth. Passwords are not replay resistant. You enter the same thing every time. And finally, authentication intent. And this is maybe getting a little bit exotic, but if you've got a bunch of users that may or may not have viruses or other malware running on their endpoints, and if you just have say, a cryptographic authenticator plugged in there, you'd like for them to actually authorize the login by doing something like. That's why they've got that little gold thing that you tap on the FIDO authenticators, is to cause a single authentication to happen when that gets tapped. And the goal there is, otherwise if it's just plugged in, there's some malware there that's saying, hey, okay, I can access this authenticator and maybe I can do proxy authentications for all of my friends. Friends of the malware, of course, being attackers to you. And then finally, sometimes if you're doing two-factor authentication, you do that with a single authenticator that has two factors. Maybe you have to enter a PIN or something in order to activate the authenticator, and then it will provide you with a single authentication as a result. So that's a two-factor authenticator. And the other way to do it is to have two separate things. Use, say, a password and a FIDO device. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. There isn't a clear winner. They're both considered two-factor authentication. They might differ a little bit in terms of the convenience and so forth, but there's advantages and disadvantages. How many authenticators you have to keep track of, that sort of thing. So they're both valid ways to do things. And amazingly, I think I made it through my presentation here. And here's a bibliography, and of course that's an eye chart, but that'll be online afterwards for any of you that are interested in looking up some of the references. So I'm happy to take questions. I hope I didn't talk too fast and make it difficult to understand.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Feel free to ask now or just
Yes?
I thought about database breaches, and you suggested that emails can be used for guessing of breaches. Is it wise to encrypt also emails and use some other type of ID for the user?
Well, we really discourage users from, or sites from using email for password recovery. Of course, the worst situation is if say you need a password reset and the site sends you your new temporary password in email. But slightly better is maybe you have to go, it sends you a link to a password reset thing or something like that. We would really much rather that users have multiple authenticators, multiple ways to log in. So I have, on some of my accounts, I've got both the one-time password thing from here. I've got a FIDO token that's in my backpack, maybe biometric authentication from my phone. But we think it's much safer to give users the ability to have different kinds of authenticators rather than to have to depend so much on password resets, because password resets are really dangerous. I mean, they are often the weak point in authentication for a user. If you can just, and if you have to call a help desk, then you have to be really careful, because there are people that are specialized in what they refer to as social engineering. And they'll call the help desk and they will tell an amazing story about what happened with their account and why they can't log in and why they need to be given the credentials to log in again. And they're very believable. I mean, at DEF CON, they have contests on it now, where they put somebody in a phone booth and let the audience listen to this expert talking to the support site at some of these places, and it's amazing how successful they sometimes are. So we really want to try and avoid having to do password resets or any other sort of account recovery as much as possible. Would really like it to not be done with email if you can possibly avoid it. Was that your question, or did I answer somebody else's question?
It was a good answer for my question.
Good, thank you. Yes?
I have two questions, or one request. If I can ask you to return the slide with you not recommending the regular protocol change, because I just want to check the university to change their behavior, because they are pushing the students to change the protocol regularly. So you have an agenda. So one first.
Let's see. Wait a minute, I think I passed it. There it is, password expiration.
The second is maybe a little bit following the question before, because I would like to ask if there are some recommendations or maybe some research regarding, not password, but regarding the account recovery, how this should be done and how this shouldn't be done.
For like when we're talking to the kind of the higher security things that the government is doing, and I'm not talking about big military things and all that. I'm talking about things like you need to, like, you're logging into the tax authorities to file your tax return or to check on your refund. I mean, we've had a lot of fraud there where attackers will come in and log in as someone else, file a fake tax return early that claims a big refund. And they'll collect the refund, and then the person goes to file their real tax return, and they say, no, you've already filed your taxes. And it's a huge problem in the United States. And so for a lot of those things, we're saying the reset doesn't have to be instant. Everyone is expecting that everything that needs to be done, like a password done occasionally, like a password reset, they're expecting like instant service, like, oh yeah, we're going to fix that in the next 5 minutes. Maybe what needs to happen is if somebody has trouble with their account, maybe they get sent a letter in the postal mail with instructions or a key in order to reset the account. Because then you've, at least, I mean, yes, the mail can perhaps be stolen, but that requires that the attacker be local. You're trying to make it difficult you're trying to make it require more attacker capabilities in order to break into the account. So requiring them to be local is another capability that they have to have now. And so maybe it takes several days in order to recover your account password, but it's secure. So what we do, we suggest, make it clear that if you require tell users, make sure you don't lose your ability to log in, because if you have to recover, it's going to take a while to do that. And tell them that they can, associate a couple of different devices, maybe have a backup device that they store in a safe place at home. Then I think that's a better approach rather than trying to always do things instantly which aren't necessarily secure. Yes?
What do you think about passwordless authentication?
Passwordless authentication, such as?
You stand up for passwordless authentication.
Well, I mean, the single-factor authentication without a password could be something like just one of these physical devices that we're talking about. And that's possible. A lot of people are uncomfortable with it because they think, well, gee, if somebody steals my cryptographic device, then that's all they need. Well, I guess that's also true of my house key. But a lot of times when people are saying passwordless authentication, they're talking about using a biometric or something like that. And I kind of explained some of the issues with biometrics, where they can't always be used, and they aren't always necessarily reliable. And we didn't even talk about some of the active attacks where, you know, there are various things that attackers can do in order to try and duplicate your fingerprint, for example, or even, you know, with an eye image or something like that. So I'm a little bit dubious about things that make too broad of a claim to be passwordless. I think, you know, biometrics, I use biometrics all the time, and it's great, but I think of it more as a convenience feature. It's secure enough for me to use on my phone, but I probably wouldn't use a biometric by itself to open my front door in my house. Yes?
You said it's better than to limit passwords, for example, for characters or something, to educate users. What is a good approach to do that? Like play this 5-minute video about the basics of internet security, or what would be a good approach?
Well, you could do that. Your users might not be happy about having to sit through a 5-minute video. I'm usually impatient like that. I would display some text. You know, the idea of the password meter, I think, is a good one because that gives users, you know, they can play with that a little bit. And the trouble is password meters aren't necessarily reliable. You know, they're mostly looking at the composition of passwords and you know, sometimes comparing against common password lists, and you know, they'll say, oh, that's not a very good one. This one's better. This one's strong. This one's really good. Usually the longer ones are the ones that are really good. So, you know, there's basically an opportunity. I would probably just, you know, display some text and a password meter that they can play with, something like that, to just to help educate them. But you know, I'm an older guy and I don't watch as many videos, so maybe your mileage may vary. Yes?
What do you think about password managers, their security, especially those password managers that are embedded in web browsers like Chrome Password Sync or Firefox Password Store and things like that? Is it safe to actually use for holding unique passwords for services?
Well, Google and Mozilla are both pretty good at security, so they're probably pretty good. I mean, you want to make sure that you've got a good, secure master password. All of these things depend on having something to unlock the password vault, if you will, and so the strength is largely dependent on that. I mean, I tend to use a dedicated password manager. I use 1Password, but there are several good ones out there. LastPass, Dashlane, I don't know what all of the good ones are. But part of the advantage there is that it works for me across devices. So I have it on my laptop, and it also works on my phone and my iPad. And they securely transfer encrypted data between them and the service. And so when I update a password in one place, it's updated everywhere. And I really like the cross-platform nature of that.
Okay, maybe follow-up question to it. The point is, I think password managers are pretty good at storing against this common attack of guessing passwords or reusing passwords and so on. But in case you have some kind of malware in your computer, which can read other processes' memory and so on, there are some problems with that. And I wonder whether if people start using password managers more, the bad guys would start, instead of trying to reuse password, they would just start to steal all the password from the manager.
That's possible. I mean, I don't.
I didn't want to hear that.
I don't. So I don't know I don't know the internals of the password managers, but I mean, at least with mine, I have to unlock it pretty frequently, and I can do that with my fingerprint on my Mac or on my phone. But it also requires me to enter the master password from time to time, just to make sure that there isn't some attack on the biometrics. So the fact that my password vault is not unlocked for very long each time is reassuring to me. Yes?
Okay. Regarding this slide, password expiration, I believe that there are some standards, like PCI DSS, that still recognize this.
Yes.
Do you see some push from NASA to those organizations, or how do you see that what they do this kind of
Yes, you're right. PCI DSS does still require expiration of passwords, and the best we can do right now is to try and spread the word, make people aware of all of the research that this is based on that show that frequent password changes are not helpful. And I'm hoping that we can eventually convince the PCI people to agree with us on that. I mean, this is a fairly new thing. Even, I mean, this was a big change that we came out with a year and a half or 2 years ago. And some of these things change slowly. And yes, there are still lots of U.S. government websites that require me to change my password every so often. And I just have to live with that. And we try and tell them that should change. Yes.
You gave us a lot of interesting information about security when it comes to passwords and stuff. But if I'm not the provider of the service that needs to be secured, but I have a service that I know that the provider does not secure it very well, is there any point to, or any place to show them so they could educate themselves about the security? Something I can do, because if I tell them some guy in our school told us, it's not very efficient, right? So.
Well, I think you've got one of the best resources for that right here in the room. Michael does sort of password storage ratings for sites, and really the goal there is to try and help them to recognize what they're doing right and what they're not doing right, and to reward good behavior.
If I can answer your question, sorry for that.
Sure.
The standards Jim is talking about, they're actually published on the internet. It's an official document from the US government, right? Which are name on it. So maybe you can send a link to that if you want.
Oh yeah.
If you can just tweet at me or tweet at Jim, we'll share the link with you if you want. Okay. It's like a PDF with a lot of boring information, but it's not as nicely designed as it's talk. It's just a regular text.
Yeah, that's what I expected, kind of.
Yeah. But it's the official link, so
Yeah, anything that we can do to help people recognize that this is that we really aren't just saying this, but we really have thought about this a lot and based it on a lot of research.
I just tweeted me on Twitter.
Yeah. And actually, that document is one of the references at the end here. So if you look at, whoops, got a little carried away there. Whoops. I keep doing that. Anyhow, this one here is Digital Identity Guidelines Authentication Lifecycle Management.
It's the middle one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I was going to try and see if I can get to it easily here. Well, I won't mess with it right now. But.
So, any more questions?
If we can briefly expand on the idea of password expiration, you mentioned that good idea not to have or not to force users to change password regularly. And the question is, how do you recognize, or do you have any consideration, how do you recognize that the password was compromised?
Well, I guess it's attacker activity, and sometimes there are a lot of people around that are kind of white hat hackers that are out collecting this information off of Tor and places like that in order to and will alert sites that they've been compromised. And so, I mean, there are times that you get those indications, and you might just be getting some. I mean, there are other banks and so forth are very good at doing behavioral things, and if they all of a sudden see a lot of activity from parts of the world that are unexpected, or times of day, or just patterns of activity that are unexpected on particular accounts, then very much like they just recently did with my credit card, and they had to issue me a new credit card, they might say, okay, this looks fraudulent. You're going to need to create a new password just in case, because we think the bad guys may have your old one. But just don't do it periodically. Don't just do it because it's 90 days or something. Unless PCI says you have to. Then I guess you have to do it.
More questions?
Yes?
What FIDO hardware do you recommend? When you're using for some good brands?
I'm sorry, good brands for?
For the FIDO hardware.
FIDO? As far as I know, they're all pretty good. Most of mine, I have several that I use to play with. I'm mostly using Yubico ones because they're sort of local to us, and I get them free at trade shows. Yeah, honestly, I'm not sure I've ever paid for a FIDO token, but yeah, they're all pretty. FIDO has a certification program where they do some testing on these, and so that helps.
More questions? Remarks or something? You got some questions, Jim?
Do I have questions for them?
Yep, feel free to ask. You have the opportunity.
So I should have asked this at the beginning, but so how many of you are students here? Okay, and then some of you are like IT administrators, or how many of you operate services that have that involve authenticating users? That's a pretty good number. Okay, well, good. I hope this was useful. It's always nice to be talking to people that are doing this, and
okay, so if you have no more questions, no. You can follow Jim on Twitter and follow me on Twitter as well. Jim will share the slides to them, right? I guess.
Yes,
I'll do that.
I'll put the slides on SlideShare.